Kia ora, I'm Erin J. Doyle. Welcome to my channel. Apologies if you hear howly windy noises, but generally the things that I think are really loud you guys don't even hear, so hopefully it's fine. Now, the other day I made brief mention of the fact that I had submitted my novel, and then I said nothing further, and so oddly enough there were almost immediate question about that. So, I thought I would combine answering that question with my actual planned video for today, which is to discuss publishing options in New Zealand, because I suspect what I perceive as New Zealand specific publishing situation might actually just be a small country in general thing, and it's not necessarily what you come across if you just Google how do I get published, because at least on English websites and on the English speaking part of YouTube, the answers you get are very American, and that's not necessarily exactly what happens in a little tiny island nation down at the bottom of the world. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what options there are in said little tiny nation and how that affects the decision that you make, or rather the decision that I made. So, I assume that anyone who's watching my videos is aware of how publishing works, but just in case someone doesn't know, the two big options that you have for publishing are indie or traditional. In indie, you have complete control over everything, but that also means it's all your responsibility. You're the one who gets an editor, you're the one who takes care of what's going on the cover, formatting everything, and you often have to pay experts to get that really well done. And then when it's published, you get a reasonably high chunk of the royalties from each sale. Versus traditional, where you're selling the rights to publish your book to a publishing company. They put in the financial investment into editors and cover design, etc. They publish the book, and then your royalties are lower than the indie option because the publisher obviously needs to make a profit as well. So I'm going to be focusing on the traditional publishing part, because indie publishing is kind of the same everywhere you go. Everyone is going to basically be faced with, can I get away with not using Amazon? No. Okay, I guess I'm publishing with Amazon. I mean, there's a few variants there, but yeah, it's a hard monster to get around. So because that's a massive international option, obviously that's pretty consistent regardless of where you are. Traditional publishing, on the other hand, a little bit different. So if you just watch YouTube videos where people are talking about their traditional publishing, or Google stuff, the basic method that you're going to find is write the book, send it to literary agents, plural, hope one of them picks you up, and then that agent is then going to successfully pitch your book to publishers, and one of them will pick up your book. And then whatever deal is made, in theory, you should get more money than if you were doing it by yourself, because your agent is going to negotiate for you and make sure you get a good deal. But then they also take a piece of the pie, but in theory you should actually still benefit from having them, even though they are taking some of that money, because they've already got you a higher payday to begin with. The other thing is that most publishing houses require submissions to be made via an agent. They don't want them direct from an author, so you kind of need the agent anyway. I think they probably started out as they get you a better deal, but now they're more of a they are essential kind of thing. So that's pretty much the path that you get told about if you Google. However, in New Zealand, the agent step is still very optional. And we have a lot of independent, not a lot, we have some independent publishing houses who not only don't require you to have an agent to submit to them, but who have a very specific wish list for their authors. So they might only accept authors from New Zealand, and it might be that you have to be a New Zealand citizen but you're allowed to live elsewhere, or if you are from somewhere else you have to live here, something like that. It always has to be in some way you're a New Zealander. And to varying degrees depending on the publishing house, they want that book to be about New Zealand. So things like a New Zealand main character in New Zealand having a New Zealandy adventure is what they're going to be interested in. And if you look on the websites, most of them very, very clearly state, don't waste our time, no, no, no. Romance, fantasy, sci-fi, and then quite often like horror and mystery as well. There's a stronger interest in contemporary, literary and historical New Zealand specific literature, and that's because I think they have quite a small little pond to work in. We've only got 5 million people in this country, and because we're an English speaking country, obviously we get inundated with books from all the other English speaking countries. So if you're a publishing house in that environment, to try and get a book that's going to be unique in amongst the bookshelves of a store that's also getting books from Australia and the UK and Canada and the US, your book has to be distinct from those in some way. So banking on the local voice kind of makes sense, right? So obviously this isn't completely universal. There are a few New Zealand writers with New Zealand publishing houses who are writing fantasy, but that's never their first book. They are people who are very well established before they try and write something different, or they are writing for a younger audience. We tolerate sci-fi fantasy for children, but not an adult fiction. To generalise, obviously to generalise, however also pretty much universally true nonetheless. So that's the publishing environment that is the most accessible to me just because of where I live. And so I still had the option of getting an agent, but I knew it wasn't necessary, and that the most successful New Zealand authors which have contracts with New Zealand publishers, I know don't have agents. I should rephrase that. The authors that I know who are in that situation don't have agents. I don't know all of them. So that was definitely something for me to consider. Like, I don't need an agent. Should I just go straight to the publisher? But then I was thinking about that whole thing of an agent does tend to get you a better deal in terms of higher royalties or a higher advance. They tend to ensure that you maintain as many rights, like film rights and merchandise, etc. as possible. So in theory, if your book's highly successful and people want to make it a movie, you get more money that you retain that potential payday. So there's still benefit to getting an agent in New Zealand, even though it wasn't strictly necessary. So I went and I looked up New Zealand agents. There's essentially none, by which I mean there's like 5, which is essentially none, right? Like, we have a small number of literary agents in the country. One of them only does children's fiction, so we're down to like 4 or 5 agencies which handle adult fiction. And then if you actually scroll through like I did and you read each person's expertise and where they're based and what they are interested in receiving books about, you get even fewer, because many of them are only interested in contemporary or historical or non-fiction. Like, it was really hard to find any who took literary fiction and fantasy. And if I'm going to sign with an agent and I know that my first book that I've written and that I'm going to be querying is literary fiction, but the next one I'm going to be writing is fiction, not fiction, fantasy, you know, obviously it seems better to have an agent that would handle both of those books with confidence rather than have them be like, well, why are you giving me this nonsense? Take your fantasy away. And then having to try and find a different agent to handle the different book. And I didn't want to get an agent who only handled literary and then be faced with, well, do I even write the fantasy? Like, trying to get it to work seemed really difficult. Given that situation where an agent is preferable but not required, and the options for agents within New Zealand were essentially non-existent because of the specific criteria that I need for an agent, which is like actually open to queries, very, very few, and takes multiple genres because that's what I write in, even fewer. So my next choice would have been to go international. Australia would be the most logical because they're next door, and New Zealand and Australia companies, if they say like New Zealand only but you're Australian, they'll probably still talk to you, and vice versa. We're mates. So that was a choice that I could have made. But then suddenly I find myself about to move to the UK. So maybe, given I was going to be physically in the UK, maybe it would make more sense to go with a UK agent. But then we come back to what have I written, and the book is literary fiction with New Zealand character. And the book's set in Spain, so maybe that's fine, right? Like, it's not a very, very tightly focused New Zealand character, New Zealand story. You'd have to be from New Zealand to understand what's going on. But I felt like it might be a slight barrier, but then maybe it wouldn't be. And I found myself going around in circles and circles and circles with this, going local or international, which is the best choice? And obviously with that sort of bottlenecking process with the options of New Zealand literary agents, if I'm going to go the New Zealand route, it would make more sense to just go straight to the publisher, because obviously the agent's not necessary, but also couldn't find one that actually would have worked for me anyway. But then if I publish a book with a New Zealand publisher, I don't have an agent for my next book, which is going to be fantasy, and that I wouldn't be able to publish with that publishing house because they don't touch fantasy. And I was just like, so I was thinking the most logical thing to do would be to go for an international agent who does thinking the stuff, literary fiction and fantasy, and hopefully sci-fi as well, so that they could represent the book they've written as well as books they might write in the future. But picking a pathway based on books that I haven't written feels a bit shush. Not quite ill-advised, but also less than optimal. Like, I plan to write fantasy books, but I never have, and it seemed like picking my path based on a possible future instead of the current reality, I don't know, I was a bit iffy about it. And then I was thinking about if I write like one ever literary fiction and then a whole bunch of sci-fi fantasy, if I had published the literary fiction with a New Zealand publisher and then I took the fantasy to an agent in some other country probably and tried to go from there, then I could still be like, this is my fantasy debut, we're moving on now from that literary novel background. Don't know how that would work. It was just, yeah, round and round in circles. And I was starting to think, okay, maybe I have convinced myself that going to like a UK agency would be the way to go. But again, then I found out I was going to be moving to the UK. And this is where it kind of became more of a, what is a sensible financial choice question? Because if, big if, I successfully sell my book in New Zealand, then I get paid in New Zealand dollars into a New Zealand bank account. Which would mean that whilst I'm off in the UK, I would have New Zealand money sitting here to quietly pay my student loan repayments, which is going to be considerably easier than trying to take a percentage of the pounds that I'm earning from my non-taxable student stipend while I'm in the UK and trying not to spend that despite the fact that I'll be on a very tight budget, and then converting it into New Zealand dollars and then sending it to New Zealand, knowing that there will be a loss of money in there because of, you know, conversion fees and blah blah blah. And maybe that's the most logical thing to do, at least from a financial perspective, is to ensure that I can pay my ongoing New Zealand bills with New Zealand money that's in New Zealand without having to worry about like converting currencies and that kind of thing, which costs money. But then if I got it published in the UK, even if I got exactly the same advance, it would actually be double, because if I converted it to New Zealand dollars and the New Zealand dollar is only worth 48 cents in the UK, like I'd get a lot more money. And it was just, as I said, going round and round going, oh, which is the best and what makes the most sense in terms of what I've written, what I plan to write, what my options here versus overseas are, and what are my immediate financial needs if this book is published. And I was like, so basically, after spending some time not able to make a decision, I decided, realistically, the chances of my first ever book being successfully published, very low. The chances of it being successfully published and, you know, sold to the first publisher that I send it to, very, very low. So I have submitted my Camino story direct to a New Zealand publisher, and we're just going to see. If they don't want it, then after I've settled in the UK, then I can start querying it in the UK, and I'll consider that to be the choice made for me. If it gets successfully published in New Zealand, then that means that that financial need of having New Zealand dollars in my New Zealand bank account would be addressed. It would mean any concerns about how saleable a New Zealand character is would go away because I'd be in New Zealand. And I basically decided to just, you know, roll with it, you know, just to do it. And we'll see. And also, the other consideration is, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, because New Zealand is a small pond, if you publish your New Zealand book in New Zealand with your little New Zealand publisher, I don't know the numbers on this, but it feels like the chances of your book being nominated for one of the major awards might be slightly higher, because there are fewer total books being produced by each publisher every year. And the reality is, if you were both lucky enough to publish the book, lucky enough to be nominated, and then super duper lucky enough to actually win, that prize money would be greater than what you'd probably make off selling the book in the first place. So that was definitely a thought as well. Oh, and the other thought that I had, this is not turning out to be very coherent, but the other thought that I was having was about marketing things. So if the book is published local to where you live, then you can do more markety things, but if it's published in a country that you're not in, how does that work? So I guess my summary is, I have no idea what the correct decision is. I I don't know if I've made the correct decision, but I made a decision because I needed to make one, and I felt like I was going around in circles, and at one point I did kind of make a list of pros and cons, and they worked out pretty even. So I was like, well, if there's no overall obvious winner between going direct to New Zealand publisher versus querying international agent, then I might as well just go with the immediately available option. And if that doesn't work, then at least I've tried it, and then I can move on to the other option. So that's what I've done. And we'll see, you know, maybe it'll work out brilliantly. Maybe we'll just have additional videos talking about my process of querying UK publishers whilst I'm studying. Who knows? But hopefully, instead there'll be a video in a couple of months going, okay, so I have a book deal, and then we'll have to figure out, yeah, how to do your part as an author in promoting your book when you're not in the country anymore. But you know, I feel like that's future me problem, and even then, only if I'm very lucky future me problem, so we're not going to worry about it. Yeah. Anyway, that's what I've been doing, and I've been talking for half an hour now, so... and it was very incoherent, my apologies. I'm really struggling to figure out how to end this video. That's all from me for today, and I'll see you next time. Bye!